So as we talk about nuclear weapons, one of the big problems, I guess, of U.S. foreign policy has been how to ensure nuclear non-proliferation, how to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons both to other countries and also countries from developing increasingly large and dangerous nuclear arsenals. So kind of get a sense of what global nuclear arsenals look like. I've got a little map up here that sort of flags who are the nuclear capable countries, countries with active nuclear weapons. There are countries on here that previously had nuclear weapons that aren't shaded in green. So South Africa and Ukraine are both countries that once had nuclear arsenals that have given them up. So you've got, a handful, 8 or 9 different countries with nuclear weapons. The vast majority of nuclear arsenals are held by the United States and Russia. And the vast majority of the US and Russia's nuclear arsenals are not actively deployed, right? They're not bolted onto missiles and they're not floating around in submarines. They're in warehouses. They're part of the stockpile rather than actively deployed nuclear weapons. Lots of countries have their nuclear weapons in sort of reserves. Only a handful of countries keep active, ready to launch at a moment's notice nuclear arsenals. So UK, France, Russia, and the US tend to have widely deployed networks of nuclear weapons. When we think about different international efforts to reduce nuclear weapons, the central agreement behind a lot of this is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. This was established in 1968, and the U.S. was a big advocate of this following China's developing of nuclear weapons. I think prior to China crossing the nuclear threshold in, I think, 1965, there was sort of a sense that nuclear weapons were maybe outside of the capability for most states. That the United States and the Soviet Union were superpowers. Britain and France had very sophisticated scientific communities. Sure, they were able to develop nuclear weapons, but when China, a country that was a developing country that didn't have what we might think of as a lot of the infrastructure that would be necessary scientifically to build nuclear weapons, was able to cross that threshold and develop a functioning bomb. I think that set off sort of alarm bells that maybe nuclear weapons were going to be spreading more wildly. And so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a diplomatic tool to get countries to agree to not develop nuclear weapons, to not transfer the technology for nuclear weapons, and that it creates an oversight mechanism through the International Atomic Energy Agency that can do inspections and reports and check to make sure that, sure enough, countries that have signed onto the NPT are not using their nuclear technology to develop weapons programs, right? That it's civilian, energy-focused, medicine-focused, research-focused, not military-focused applications of nuclear technology. It's also worth noting that the United States tried to sweeten the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for countries that signed on informally as sort of a side agreement by noting that countries that developed nuclear weapons would potentially be targets of nuclear retaliation by the United States. But countries that agreed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that forswore nuclear weapons, that didn't have nuclear arsenals, that the United States would never launch a nuclear strike at such a country, that would be unacceptable. It sort of entrenches this idea that some countries are appropriate targets for nuclear weapons and others aren't. In addition to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is signed onto by the vast majority of countries, there have been multiple agreements over the years between the United States and Russia trying to stabilize those nuclear arsenals. Some of those are anti-ballistic missile treaties. Some of those are related to conventional forces in Europe. Some of those are intermediate range missile agreements. But I'll flag here some of the really big agreements that focused on trying to reduce the active and deployed stockpiles of the United States and the Soviet Union. So the first really aggressive effort to rein in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union occurred in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and was called SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, in which the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to freeze the number of surface missiles that the two countries had, that they would regulate how rapidly they were expanding sub-based missile systems, and that they both promised that they wouldn't be developing anti-ballistic missile systems. SALT was agreed to. It began a round of new negotiations called SALT II that never really got finalized. It was interrupted when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, that the United States sort of pulled the plug. But the agreements they were putting in place to start working toward a reduction in arsenal size, that didn't go away. In fact, it sort of jumped into two different tracks. So one of the things that came out of that was a negotiation over a comprehensive test ban treaty that wouldn't just be about the United States and the Soviet Union, but would be a global agreement to stop testing nuclear weapons. And then it started another track of negotiations that, as the Soviet Union disintegrates and turns into Russia, becomes a series of treaties called START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. There was an agreement in, I think, 1992-ish, another one in around 2000. There was a follow-up agreement called SORT. And then the most recent New START agreement was signed in 2009 through 2011. I think it was ratified in 2010. And came into effect in 2011. And the idea of New START is to reduce US and Russian nuclear arsenals from around 2000-ish, where they had been after some of the first rounds of reductions, down to 800 actively deployed nuclear weapons for both countries, and also to reduce the number of launch vehicles, right? So fewer missiles, fewer submarine missiles, fewer bombers, right? Just reducing those launch vehicles. And that agreement goes through 2021 and can be renewed. So that's going to be coming up here in the not too distant future. And then a final agreement that really forms the backbone of global efforts at counter-proliferation is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which countries agree to not explode nuclear devices, whether it's in the open atmosphere, or whether it's underwater, or whether it's underground. That countries forswear all nuclear testing. The vast majority of countries in the world have signed on to this and have ratified this, including countries that have nuclear weapons. There are countries that have withdrawn, North Korea. There are countries that didn't sign, India and Pakistan. And the United States signed the Nuclear Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but has not ratified it. So it's not in effect for the United States. And the United States justified that on national security grounds. The United States needs to regularly test its nuclear arsenal to make sure that it's actually still functioning and that it actually still works. And then the United States may want to develop new nuclear designs for smaller bombs, or bombs that work under different conditions. And that would require testing to make sure that those weapons are effective. So there's been a whole variety of agreements that have been put in place diplomatically to try to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. There's a whole debate to be had over whether these efforts have been effective, and there's a whole debate to be had about how these things are enforced, but that's a debate that we can have going forward.